If you've ever felt the urge to hit rock bottom in December, I highly recommend getting dumped 2 days before Christmas and then having your flight home canceled on Christmas Eve. Top it off with a dead heater in your apartment, and you're basically starring in the saddest indie holiday film ever made. So when my coworker Shannon casually said, "Hey, the senior center down the block needs volunteers for New Year's Eve," I think I said yes just so I wouldn't sit alone in my freezing apartment with takeout and a pity bottle of wine. I didn't expect anything from it, maybe a few hours of wiping tables, playing bingo, and listening to a war story or two. What I didn't expect was him. He introduced himself as Marcus, a nurse covering the night shift, wearing dark blue scrubs and a badge that read Marcus ARN. He had this calm, quiet energy that stood out immediately, like the kind of person who doesn't rush through silence, who makes you feel like standing still might actually be okay. We met over a tray of finger sandwiches that had clearly been sitting out too long. "Turkey, or tuna roulette," I said, poking at the tray with my gloved hand. He smiled, small but genuine. "It's better if you pretend it's fancy. Like tapas." "Ah, yes, aged delicacies." Marcus chuckled, then stuck out his hand. "I'm Marcus. First NYE spent entirely sober and under fluorescent lights." "Ryan," I said, shaking it. "Same, though I think my last New Year's was a solo dance party and a bottle of bad Prosecco." "Well," he said, nodding toward the hallway, "I think this one might beat that." We were both technically on duty, but the vibe was pretty relaxed. Most of the residents were watching the countdown from the dining room, where someone had hooked up a projector playing a grainy live stream of Times Square. The staff had handed out paper hats and cheap noisemakers, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe things weren't as bleak as they'd seemed. At one point, Marcus and I ended up next to each other by the piano, where a sweet older lady named Elsie was playing Auld Lang Syne, with the sort of trembling grace that made your heart hurt. "She told me earlier," Marcus whispered, leaning in slightly. "She played that at her wedding. Her husband was deployed a week later. He didn't come back." I swallowed hard, watching Elsie's fingers hover above the keys like she was touching ghosts. "She still plays it every year," Marcus added. "Says it's the only time it feels like he's back in the room." I glanced over at him. His eyes were fixed on her, soft, focused, like nothing else existed for him in that moment. "You get stories like that all the time?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "Yeah, and you never really get used to them." There was a pause, long and full. "I think I needed to hear that tonight," I said. "Kinda puts things in perspective." Marcus turned to me, curious. "Rough year?" "Rough month," I said, then corrected myself. "Rough couple of months." He didn't pry, just gave a small nod of understanding. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Grief is weird like that. It shows up in the quietest corners. But sometimes, that's where new things grow too." I didn't reply, but I didn't need to. We worked side by side for the rest of the evening, passing out little cups of cider, helping a woman named Doris fix her wig, cleaning up a cake disaster when someone knocked over the dessert table. Spoiler, it was me. Every now and then, our shoulders would bump, or we'd glance at each other at the same time. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, but when the countdown hit 10 and someone turned up the volume, we ended up standing next to each other again. Two strangers in a crowd of people who remembered more New Year's than we'd probably ever see. "Do you think you'll remember this one?" I asked him. Marcus looked over at me, his voice quiet beneath the noise. "Yeah, I think I will." We didn't kiss when the ball dropped. No sweeping fireworks or dramatic music cue. But our eyes met when the room erupted with cheers, and he smiled at me like we'd both just survived something we hadn't been able to name. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The thing about spending New Year's Eve in a retirement home is that everything happens earlier. Midnight? That's for the night owls. Most of the residents started heading to bed by 9:45, and by 10:15, the place was winding down into a soft, sleepy quiet. I stayed behind to help clean up. So did Marcus. We moved slowly through the common room, collecting paper hats, empty cups, and confetti that had somehow made its way into every corner. I found myself glancing at him more often now, watching the way he moved, steady, intentional, like nothing ever caught him off guard. At one point, I dropped a handful of napkins and muttered, 2026's first disaster, right here. Marcus grinned as he bent down to help. Not a bad way to start. We kept working, and the silence between us didn't feel awkward. It felt like the kind of pause that lets you breathe. Elsie reminds me of my grandma, I said eventually. She used to play piano too, Christmas carols, mostly. But she had this one song she only played when she missed my grandfather. Marcus glanced at me, which was Moon River. He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't say anything. She died a couple years ago, I added. I didn't even know how much I'd missed that song until the house was quiet. Marcus stood up, brushing his palms on his scrub pants. Funny how something small like a melody can carry so much. I looked at him for a moment. Do you have one? He paused, then smiled. My dad used to whistle this jazz tune. Real old school stuff. Blue and Green, Miles Davis. He'd hum it while cooking breakfast on Sundays. Still play it? All the time, he said softly. Mostly when I miss him. The lights in the hallway dimmed a little. Part of the nightly routine, but neither of us moved. We were standing close now, somewhere between the folding chairs and the piano, and suddenly the room felt warmer than it had all night. I'm glad I came tonight, I said. Yeah? Marcus asked, voice low. I was expecting to feel sad. Or numb. Or both. But this, I gestured vaguely to the room, this actually helped. He nodded, eyes on mine. Me too. And then we just stood there for a while, neither of us moving, both of us clearly feeling something and not quite sure what to do with it. I think they're locking up the front, he finally said. I smiled, breaking the tension. Guess that's our cue. We headed to the coat rack near the lobby, and I reached for my jacket. Marcus grabbed his, then hesitated. You driving home? Yeah, just across town. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then stopped, then started again. Would you wanna? He scratched the back of his neck. I mean, sometime next week maybe? Get coffee? I felt myself smile before I even answered. Yeah, I'd like that. He looked relieved, and something about that made my chest tighten in a good way. We stepped outside together. The night was freezing. One of those sharp, clear skies where every star looks close enough to touch. My breath came out in a cloud, but I didn't feel cold. I hope your 2026 is better than your 2025, Marcus said, stuffing his hands in his coat pockets. I laughed. Honestly, the bar is so low, he grinned. Then you're already winning. I watched him walk toward his car, a quiet calm settling over me. When he turned to wave once before getting in, I waved back. And standing there in the parking lot of a retirement home, under a sky full of stars, I realized I wasn't dreading the new year anymore. In fact, I kind of couldn't wait. The funny thing about new beginnings is that they never look like you expect. Mine didn't come with champagne, or a midnight kiss, or a crowded rooftop countdown. It came in the form of a quiet nurse with a tired smile and a shared memory over jazz and mashed potatoes. The Monday after New Year's, I was back at work, half asleep at my desk when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Hey, it's Marcus from NYE. You still into that coffee? I didn't even finish reading the message before I was typing back. Absolutely. Name a time. We met 2 days later at a local cafe near the hospital he worked at. He showed up in dark jeans and a puffy coat, a welcome change from the scrubs, though I couldn't help but feel a weird flicker of nerves, seeing him outside the context of warm Jell-O and bingo music. Guess this is what we look like without name tags, I joked as he approached the table. He laughed. I almost brought mine just in case. It was easy. That's what surprised me most. No awkward pauses. No fumbling through fake small talk. We talked about our families, the residents we'd met on New Year's, and somehow stumbled into a 2-hour discussion about whether or not people actually like black licorice or are just pretending for attention. At some point, our drinks went cold, and Marcus glanced at his watch. I've got to head back in for the night shift soon. I nodded, trying not to look disappointed. Back to the trenches. He stood up, hesitating for a second. Then he pulled out his phone. Can I get your number? Not just for emergency cupcake spills. I smiled, unlocking mine to swap contacts. Only if you promise not to call me from the medication room at 3 a.m. Tempting, he said, grinning as he tucked his phone back in his coat. But I'll play it cool. As he left, he touched my shoulder, a quick, warm gesture, but it lingered longer in my mind than it should have. The next couple weeks passed in a quiet rhythm. We started texting every few days. Nothing dramatic. Memes, dumb updates about his shifts, random late-night questions like if you could only eat one breakfast for the rest of your life. My answer, breakfast burrito. His, banana pancakes. And then one Friday night, out of nowhere, he texted, "What are you doing tonight?" I was on the couch, halfway through a bad movie. Absolutely nothing. Why? There's a movie night at the home. Residents pick the flick. It's usually black and white and way too long, but they make popcorn and sometimes let volunteers stay. You inviting me on the most geriatric date in history? Guilty. You in? I showed up 30 minutes later. The movie was Casablanca. I'd never seen it all the way through, but the residents were glued to it, quoting lines before they even happened. Marcus sat next to me in the back row. It wasn't romantic. Not really. Just two people sitting side by side, quietly sharing a night with people who'd seen a dozen New Year's Eves come and go. When Ingrid Bergman said, "We'll always have Paris," I glanced over at Marcus. He was watching the screen, his expression calm, but when he caught me looking, he smiled. And that smile did something to me. We didn't hold hands, we didn't kiss, but something shifted. Something softened. A week after movie night, I found myself walking into the nursing home again. This time not for a shift or a holiday, but just because I wanted to see him. I told myself it was to drop off a box of cookies one of the residents had mentioned missing from their childhood, some weird regional brand I found online and had overnighted like a lunatic. But really, I just wanted an excuse to see Marcus again. He met me in the staff lounge, still in scrubs, still looking like the only person in the world who could make hospital lighting seem almost flattering. "You're back," he said with a smile, like he hadn't been checking his phone all morning. "I brought a peace offering," I said, holding up the box. "Apparently Doris thinks modern cookies are flavorless garbage." He laughed, taking the box and peeking inside. "Oh my God, my grandma used to buy these." See? It's not just me. We stood there for a moment. The kind of casual pause that felt charged in a way I was still getting used to. Being around Marcus was starting to feel like coming up for air. "You're off today?" he asked. I nodded. Took a mental health day, which, so far, has included bad coffee, a lukewarm bagel, and now cookie delivery. Honestly, that sounds like a full itinerary. He motioned for me to follow him down the hall. We ended up in a small corner room used for arts and crafts, where two residents were working on puzzles, and one woman was knitting with surgical precision. Marcus crouched next to one of the tables, said a few quiet words to the woman knitting, then came back over to me. "You know what she just told me?" he said, grinning. "What?" "She said I better kiss the cookie boy before someone else does." I felt my face flush, but I tried to play it cool. "Well, I am very kissable." He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that right?" "That's what Doris said last time I brought pudding cups." Marcus leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, and looked at me in a way that made the air feel a little heavier. "I know we've been kind of circling this," he said, "but I like you, and I'd really like to take you out sometime, somewhere that doesn't smell like hand sanitizer." My pulse jumped in the best way. "I'd really like that too," I said, smiling. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. His hand brushed mine, not quite holding it, but just enough to send a jolt through my chest. "I'm off Friday," he said. "Dinner?" "Definitely." Then he leaned in, not quite a kiss, but close enough to feel his breath, and said, "Thanks for the cookies, by the way." I swallowed. Anytime. We pulled apart when a resident shuffled past the doorframe, muttering something about kids these days, and I had to bite back a laugh. But even after I left, even walking back into the cold January afternoon, my hand still tingled from where he'd touched it. I thought about that moment for the rest of the day. Friday came faster than I expected. I spent an unreasonable amount of time standing in front of my closet, trying to find that elusive outfit combo that says, I didn't overthink this, even though, of course, I had. It had been a long time since I'd gone on a real date, one that didn't involve swiping, scheduling, and ultimately ghosting. But something about Marcus felt different, real, grounded, like we'd skipped the surface-level bullshit and already knew something deeper about each other. He picked a quiet Italian place on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but cozy in that way that made you lean in to hear each other better. When I walked in, he was already there, flipping through the wine list. He looked up, and that smile, the easy one, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. You clean up nice, he said, standing to greet me. You say that like I don't always look this good, I joked. Fair enough, he said, chuckling. We ordered wine, shared a plate of garlic bread that was way too garlicky, but neither of us cared, and somewhere between the second glass and the main course, the conversation started to drift into places I didn't expect. He told me more about his job, how he'd started in emergency care before switching to long-term, how it wasn't the most glamorous part of nursing, but he liked the slowness of it. The stories, the way some of the residents looked at him like he was the last person in the world they trusted. It's funny, he said, swirling his wine, how most people think being around the end of life all the time is depressing. But it's the opposite for me. It's grounding. I watched him for a moment before saying, I get that. He glanced up. You do? Yeah, I said. It's like being around people who've lived that much. Makes you think harder about how you're living now. He nodded slowly. Like, that hit him in a place he didn't expect. Then he looked at me and said, I'm glad you volunteered that night. Me too. The rest of the evening unfolded like that. Easy, close, personal. When the check came, we both reached for it like two people on a sitcom. I'm getting this one, he said. No way, I brought the cookies, remember? He raised an eyebrow. Is this how you negotiate? Only with people I want to see again. That shut him up in the best way. We walked out together into the cold, breath fogging in the street lamp glow. His car was parked across the street, mine just a few spots down. We stood by the sidewalk, not quite ready to say goodbye. So, I said, stuffing my hands in my pockets, what now? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression unreadable, but soft. Then he reached out and touched the side of my arm. Barely there, just a hint of pressure. And then, just like that, he kissed me. It wasn't a fireworks in the sky kind of kiss. It wasn't slow and dramatic either. It was honest. Warm. Familiar in a way I didn't know I'd been needing. When we pulled back, I couldn't help but smile. He looked almost shy for the first time. Was that okay? He asked. I laughed, lightheaded. You're asking now? He grinned. Just being polite. We stood there for another moment, neither of us saying anything. And honestly, we didn't need to. Everything important had already been said. After that night, things didn't turn into some whirlwind romance, and that's what made it feel real. Marcus and I started seeing each other more, but quietly. No big declarations or over-the-top gestures. Just small things. Texts that started with, you up, and turned into actual conversations. Walks in the cold where we'd share a scarf because he always forgot his. Nights where I'd meet him outside the nursing home after his shift with a thermos of hot cocoa and 2 plastic cups. We were figuring each other out. Not just who we were alone, but who we could be together. The next time I saw him at the retirement home, it wasn't as a volunteer. It was just me stopping by with snacks. A few residents remembered me, including Elsie, who tugged me aside and whispered, Your nurse friend. He watches the door more when you're here. I smiled, but didn't say anything. I think she knew anyway. Later that night, Marcus and I ended up in that same empty rec room from weeks before, sitting across from each other at a craft table, with leftover glitter stuck to our sleeves. "You know," he said, looking up from the clipboard he'd been filling out, "I'm not used to this." "To what?" "To letting someone in. My job's always been, I don't know, a wall. People see the uniform and think I've got everything handled. But then I go home, and the quiet hits harder than it should." I leaned forward. "You're allowed to need someone too." His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something vulnerable behind them. Not weakness, just honesty. "I think I've been needing you more than I realized," he said. That caught me off guard. I didn't have a polished response, so I just reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "You should know that." He nodded slowly, then flipped his hand to lace his fingers through mine. It was quiet and warm and good. By the time February rolled around, we were officially something, even if we hadn't said the word. People started to notice. His coworkers teased him. Mine asked why I was smiling at my phone so much. But it didn't matter. We didn't rush it. We just kept showing up for each other. He'd come to my place after late shifts and fall asleep with his head on my chest, exhausted but peaceful. I'd show up on his days off with bad coffee and some excuse to stay all day. It was messy in places. He worked long hours, I was juggling a demanding job, but there was always effort, always intention, and maybe that's what made it feel different. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And every time I thought back to New Year's Eve, those blinking lights, that cheap cider, the way Marcus looked at me when the clock struck midnight, I remembered that it all started with one quiet night in a room full of people who'd already loved and lost and lived through more than we could imagine. They'd shown us what it looked like to try, to keep trying, and now we were doing the same. Valentine's Day came and went without much fanfare. We didn't do roses or reservations. Marcus worked a double shift, and I spent most of the day glued to my laptop, drowning in a deadline. But around 8 p.m., my door buzzed. It was him. Hair a little messy, hoodie thrown over scrubs, holding a white takeout bag in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. "Hey," he said, that tired half-smile lighting up his whole face. "I brought dumplings." I stepped aside, pulling him in with a hug that lasted longer than it probably needed to. "And this," he added, handing me the paper. I opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn card, probably something he'd stolen from the arts and crafts room. It had hearts made of tissue paper, a stick figure version of him and me, and underneath it said, "Happy V-Day. You make things easier, even when they're not. I like that. I like you. A lot." I felt my throat tighten. I looked up. "You drew this?" "Elsie helped. She said my hearts were too. Phoned in." I laughed and kissed him. Soft, slow, grateful. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," he said. "I know we haven't really talked about what this is, but I've never felt this way with someone before. It's different." "Same here," I said quietly. "It's not loud. It's just right." We ate dumplings on the couch, legs tangled under a blanket, watching reruns of some crime show neither of us followed. He fell asleep partway through, head on my shoulder, breathing slow and steady. And that night, watching him sleep, I realized something. New Year's Eve was supposed to be just a placeholder, a way to avoid being alone. But it became the start of something real. A couple months later, the retirement home hosted a spring open house. Balloons, lemonade, a terrible jazz band that played The Girl from Ipanema twice. Marcus was working. I came just to visit. I brought more of those old cookies, and I caught Elsie eyeing me again from her wheelchair. "You stuck around," she said, as I crouched beside her. "I did." She reached out, took my hand, and patted it. "Good. He's one of the good ones." I looked up and saw Marcus across the room, helping a resident with a stubborn wheelchair break, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hand steady and kind. Yeah, he really was. And now, somehow he was mine. That summer, Marcus and I spent a weekend out of town, his first real time off in months. We rented a tiny cabin by a lake 2 hours away. No Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and nothing on the agenda except naps, books, and too many snacks. The first night, after dinner, we sat on the porch watching the sky change. Light bleeding into dark, crickets starting up their nightly choir. He was leaned back in one of those creaky wooden chairs, barefoot, ankles crossed, a beer in hand. I looked at him in the soft light and thought, this feels like a life already. A small one, a quiet one, but real. Ours. He turned his head and caught me staring. What? Nothing, I said, grinning, just checking that you're still real. He laughed, shaking his head. You're such a sap. I leaned over and kissed his shoulder. You love it. Unfortunately, we stayed out until the stars took over the sky, and then some. Just sitting, talking about dumb things, TV shows from our childhoods, the worst dates we'd ever been on, the weird ways we each brush our teeth. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't fireworks. But it was ours. Later that night, tangled in bed under thin sheets, he whispered, I never thought I'd have this. I turned toward him. Have what? This kind of ease, he said. Like, I always figured relationships were supposed to be work. Fighting, fixing, compromising to the point where you didn't recognize yourself anymore. I rested my forehead against his. I used to think love had to be loud to be real. Same. A beat passed. Then he added, but this, it's quiet. Yeah, he whispered. And it fits. We went back to the nursing home that fall for another event. This time, the staff had put together a photo wall of the residents' younger days. There were black and white wedding photos, faded vacation snapshots, one picture of a couple kissing under a confetti storm at what looked like a very vintage New Year's party. As we walked through the halls, hand in hand, Marcus nudged me. That's gonna be us one day, he said, nodding at a photo of two men from the 70s, holding hands at a backyard cookout. You think we'll still look this good? He laughed. Speak for yourself. I'll be in scrubs until I'm 80. I leaned closer. Then I guess I better stick around. He looked at me like he already knew. And I think, deep down, I already knew too. So, know that New Year's Eve didn't start with romance. It started with awkward small talk, finger sandwiches, and the fluorescent lights of a nursing home hallway. But it turned into this. Into us. And years from now, when someone asks how we met, I'll probably say, it was New Year's Eve. I showed up just to avoid being alone. But I ended up finding the one person who made me feel like I never had to be again.